Hello and welcome to Skeleton Songs.
And the question is, it occurs to me, when you say Skeleton Songs, is that the sequel to Skeleton Song? Like Aliens was a sequel to Alien?
No, if it was a sequel to Skeleton Songs, and what I do is I turn one of the T's into like a 2, and then it'd be like Skeleton songs.
And then you'd get people complaining on Twitter, and you get people ironically putting 2 in lots of other things, and then it would become...
Step 4 profit, that's how it will work.
Well, coincidentally, we're talking about sequels of nostalgia, aren't we?
We are. Good segue.
Tell me where the word nostalgia comes from, Lottie Bevan.
Well, I'm glad you asked me this, Alexis. Nostalgia was actually coined as a term in the 17th century by a man named Johannes Hofer, who was from which nation?
Schweiz.
Yes, well done. I'm surprised you could tell from my bad semi-German accent, but yes, he was. And he coined it in response to seeing a number of ailments complained of by Swiss soldiers, Swiss mercenaries particularly, who left Switzerland to go off and fight elsewhere, and then complained of like chronic like stomach issues and like hearing noises. And he genuinely thought, and this is not a lie, that this was a physical manifestation of homesickness brought on, and I'm not joking, by the clang of cowbells, and the incessant clang of cowbells had actually caused ear and brain damage to these men, who then went abroad, and when they didn't have that kind of recurring noise, actually developed problems as a result. Which is funny. And he developed it as a theory in relation to a German idea called Heimweh. I don't speak German, I have no idea how you pronounce it. But that means homesickness. So it was this idea that there was a physical, actual disease from missing your home so much.
So I you know, Sunless Sea, I always say there were sort of 3 explicit intentional themes, and there was a secret 4th thread tying them all together, although it wasn't that secret because I've talked about it a lot since. But it was a game, as everyone knows who's played it, of loneliness, survival and exploration. And when I was writing content for it, and when I brought other people in to write content for it, I wanted to make these themes manifest. So I wanted to give them a really clear steer on what kind of things to write about, without saying you have to put loneliness, exploration, survival in the title of every story. And I settled on thinking it's about home. The whole Sunless Sea experience is leaving home and then returning home, and home or its absence connects to loneliness. You can only explore places that aren't home, and home is the place where it's safe to survive. We don't need to worry about survival. So home or its absence is immediately sort of instinctively relevant to all those. So I kept thinking, when I was writing stories, so the Deviless, who you meet in Mount Palmerston, for example, she's been exiled from hell, and she talks about that. The Island Codex is also full of exiles. When Amal al-Motar and subsequently Richard Cobbett wrote Pigmoat Isle, it was about the battle of 2 tribes who happened to be guinea pigs and rats, to determine who could call it home, and so on and so on. And you get this sense of longing for the unknown, and the sense of longing for home, a proper yin and yang stuff. And there's all these words for it. Nostalgia is you know, like a lot of words, English borrowed it from elsewhere. And there's this other German word, Sensucht.
Oh, okay, Sensucht, yeah.
And Saudade, which seems to be something very similar in Portuguese. And Hiraeth is the Welsh version.
Which is a beautiful word.
And there's something called Han I've come across in Korean, which I think is not really the same, but it's not dissimilar. It's this, again, it's the same sense of beautiful sadness or an ache that's sweet. But all these things up to a point with different implications and flavours are all a longing for something that you can't have, or you did have, or you'll never have, or no one has ever had. And it's not always clear which, because if it's something you don't have, you're not sure what it is.
Well, I think nostalgia specifically does seem to have a very specific connection to home as a concept. So Hofer defined it, actually, I find fascinatingly, as a moral pain, which relates to forced separation from home and society. And I think what's really apparent in Sunless Sea is when you are at home in Wolfstack Docks, you know, the beautiful glittering lights, you get this lovely music that comes in and says, you know, you're safe now. But there's also an implication, is there not, that you probably have some sort of family, if not your own, or if you're on your own, you know, your own upkeep, that you have to facilitate by going out into the dark and earning money and then coming back. You don't really have the option of just staying at home, right? So you have these moments of danger and isolation and strangeness and newness, which is forced upon you in order to maintain your home and potentially your family, which I think is something that certainly the Swiss mercenaries, I'm sure, could identify with. And I think a lot of people, you know, people have to do stuff in life to support themselves, which means they have to be apart from people. You get all the classic stories of the guy who works, you know, 20-hour days to support the kid that he never sees, and maybe the kid goes up and resents that, but the dad was doing what he could to facilitate home. So I think there is something specific that is more than just a sort of ache for something that's now past. That's very specific in the sense of nostalgia, to do with actual, like, a sense of home and family.
I think you're right, and I think
it's literally making my chest tighten up. Like, it's such a sort of profound thing. I don't know if you're feeling it as well.
I do actually, and I think
you're quite an elegiac soul.
Well, I am, but also I think we've talked before about Christopher Alexander's wonderful point that 90% of the things we feel we have in common with other people.
Yeah.
And there's 10% that makes us different. You know, that's why we're individuals, thank God, not clone bots. But that 90% really is what we have in common. And that sense of you know how you feel when you see the light across the ocean.
Yeah. There's also something I found interesting. I read some sort of reference to a lot of psychologists have studied nostalgia, because it is this sort of quite hard to define sense, but it does seem to be very pervasive across most of human experience. And someone discovered that there is a high correlation between people who feel nostalgia quite acutely and people who also are quite, I think the phrase is, growth orientated. So the feeling is that the feeling of nostalgia actually serves to highlight how far you have come, which is a positive thing, because if you're stuck in stasis and you're forever a child, or you're forever in the same situation, most people probably don't find that super fulfilling, because most people would agree that part of life is new experiences and kind of exploring things and, you know, getting older and starting a family and all this kind of stuff. And that nostalgia in some ways serves to sort of throw that into relief. So in the same way, it's a nice feeling, nostalgia, because you're remembering this sort of honey-coloured glow of the past and all the good memories and forgetting all the bad stuff that also happened. But it's also a sort of mechanism in your brain to say, you know, well done for leaving the nest or for making your own
That's
life.
really interesting, and that makes sense. That segues neatly into the sequels thing, because one of the things I had on my very rough list to bring up with sequels is there's a constant balance, isn't there, when you're looking for new experiences, whether it's films and books or whether it's going places or jobs or whatever, between the comfortable and the exciting, or the reliable and the risky. And if you spend your whole life reading only books by the 5 authors you liked when you were a kid or when you first turned 18, then you're probably missing out, and you're probably not that interesting to talk to. On the other hand, if you spend your whole life, every book you read is by an author you've never read before, then that sounds very tiring. and I do, I read quite widely, but when I'm in bed at like 10:30, 11:30 at night, I want to be reading something with a strong plot by an author I've read before, because I know I'm going to enjoy it, and I want something to help wind down after the day. And I think this is we were watching Foundation, the Apple TV show, last night. So it's a TV show of books written in the 1950s, and they've taken it in a really. Some things are very, very similar, some things are totally different, and obviously intentionally so. And broadly speaking, I'm big in favour of that. And I love the books when I read them when I was a kid, and I like they're doing something different and interesting with it. But I've lost my thread. I was making some sort of point about risk and experience. Yeah, often when we see remakes or sequels or reimaginings, there's always this tension. Often we're troubled because there's this tension between wanting the original experience and wanting a new version of the original experience, you're too faithful to the original experience, then it's very boring because you know every line that's coming, and you stray too far from the original experience, and you get a sort of uncanny valley effect of this is not the property I loved.
Well, I think the experience is conflating two very different things that go hand in hand when you actually engage with something, nostalgic or otherwise, which is the actual art itself and then how it makes you feel, and that's the experience when you combine it. And I think I wrote about nostalgia in a column when I was writing for game magazine Wireframe, and one of the points I made was you might be wanting to be back in the 1980s, but you can't stop living in the 2020s. So realistically what was happening in the 1980s TV programme that you remember fondly and want to experience again, it was a man with a shoebox on his head with £5 budget for the lighting, and then the camera fell over halfway through, but we kind of went with it, and we called it kooky and interesting. And you don't actually want that. If Netflix presented a show that was made in exactly the same way that 1980s film that you love was made, you'd think this is nonsense and it looks really cheap and I can't engage with it. What you want from that is something that fits the 2020s standards of art these days, whether it's a Netflix film or a game or whatever, or a book, and that includes things not just budget, but also includes things like cultural sensitivities and different ideas about the world now, but we want it to make us feel the way it did when we were 10 in the 80s, whatever it was, and I think that is an impossible goal to set. Maybe not impossible, because there are a couple of occasions where people will say that actually this did really well and it really did make me feel like I was back in X in a kind of positive way, but I think people are fundamentally setting themselves up for failure by saying, I want this thing to be modern and shiny and new and different and not exactly the same, but also to make me feel like it did the first time I felt it.
If it were possible to identify, if it were easy to identify what makes people feel a particular way, what makes a particular person feel a particular way, then let me be brought a sentence more usefully. A lot of the skill of being a good artist, whether it's a director or a writer or a painter, is identifying consciously or unconsciously what will promote that reaction. And everybody, not everybody can do that, but everybody is an expert on their own emotions. So they are in some senses better informed. There's this old adage about feedback that you can't tell somebody that they're wrong for the way they respond to your work, and that's true. It's also quite rare for somebody who is responding to your work and doesn't like it to know exactly how they want to, how it should be fixed, what would make them feel the way they want to feel.
So we're just being attacked by our cat here.
Yeah,
so
the cat is trying to bite the microphone.
Any noises, that's our cat Sula-chan, who fell off a balcony and miraculously survived and wants us to give her attention to make up for that fact.
Yeah, what's she doing, she's saying.
Anyway, you were saying, I'm sorry, about a very serious topic.
Yeah, so that's the thing is people know the way they want to feel, but they don't know the way the way to make themselves feel that way. And if they did, it would be sort of masturbatory. If you're making art for yourself, that is the phrase that comes to mind, right? And if you direct the experience too precisely, that's what you're doing. You're just making an experience for yourself. You're not having commerce with another human soul. You're just sitting in your own mirrored box, creating your own perfect reflections. This
would be the sort of 10% in isolation from the 90%.
Yeah, and sequels. What people really want is to revisit the experience they had when they were in single-digit age and saw a beloved film for the first time.
Yeah.
And sorry, you can't get that back. And if you watch the original film, you'll touch it. It's Proust and the Madeleines, but Star Wars.
Yeah.
But you can't get all the way. But understandably, people, because everyone is, and I'm not being ironical, the best expert on their own emotions, people often feel pettish when somebody says, well, if I gave you what you asked for, it wouldn't give you what you want.
Because you think, don't tell me how I'd feel.
Yeah.
And I think games is particularly rife for this, right? Because games, as an industry, I think has more connection with childhood than most art forms. And this is why a lot of games industry people are devoted to saying things like, I'm making a very grown-up and important game about very serious things. We don't necessarily hear a sort of fine art painter making a really significant point about, I'm going to paint a picture, but it's going to be for adults. Because there is the intrinsic in games, this sense that there is a connection to childhood. And I'm really not hating on games here. It's just a fact of what we do. And this is partly because a lot of kids grow up playing games, particularly now more than ever, just because of the prevalence of technology and availability. And then as you grow into adulthood, you lose the leisure time that you spent playing games. And I think also games make things simple and clean. They make life simple and clean in a way that life isn't. And that doesn't matter so much when you're 8. But by the time you're 30 and you have children, for example, I think you might yearn for a time where you could complete all the tasks on your quest list, or you might have a clear idea of right and wrong, and who was a nice person and a bad person. And just a period of time devoted to yourself, not worrying about anybody else, bottling about in a nice world. So games, I think, has a particular connection to nostalgia in the sense of evoking childhood experiences in a way that other art forms don't, and that is why the industry is so, I would say, rife with sequels and remakes and references to what we loved in the past. And that's more complicated as well, because there's lots of kind of financial and production decisions that go into it. Like, for example, if you have a mega hit from the 90s, that IP is very strong and you can probably make significant money with that IP doing something new, whereas making a new IP is a bit riskier because who knows how well that's going to do. But yeah, so I think that's why it's particularly it's apparent in games.
It's the other side of sequels. I had a ridiculous argument with my friend Ivan years ago about The Lady Killers, which was a 1955 comedy, a black comedy with Alec Guinness, and then a 2004 Cohen brothers remake. Both of us loved the original, both of us loved the Cohen brothers, but Ivan was outraged that they were doing a remake. I think it was Barry Sonnenfeld originally, and the Cohens took it over because they often work with him. But and he kept saying, I don't understand why they're doing that. I don't understand, what's gained from it. The original was so good. And there is probably a creative argument that you might want to reinvent something from the 50s for something for the noughties, so people born in the 80s and 90s can enjoy it. But obviously, film studios are fundamentally commercial machines. Doesn't mean that they're run entirely by silicon-hearted accountants, but that's obviously a major consideration. And we were arguing past each other because I kept saying, it might or might not be as good as the original, but the reason it's been done is to make money. And it's like arguing about the nutritional value of food compared to its taste or its appearance. It's that they might coincide, but they won't necessarily. And if you take a stern view on one, you might much on the other. And the thing about sequels, they look like the most bankable possible place to put your money. They're not necessarily. Been plenty of sequels that have flopped, but it just makes it easier to explain what the hell it is. It's this, but two.
Well, and I think that raises two interesting points. One is a slightly kinder way of looking at it, although I think you're right that they are usually a sort of safe financial bet, is that a lot of old golden age stuff, particularly games, is no longer really playable by a new generation of gamers. So, for example, you take something like the first Silent Hill game, or recently I actually bought, because it was on sale, all of the Tomb Raider games, which I grew up and was really significant in me being in games in the first place. And I loaded up, I think it was Tomb Raider 2, so I was like, Tomb Raider 1 probably too janky, but I'll give 2 a go. And I lasted about 5 minutes because the control scheme was so annoying and the camera didn't do what I was expecting it to, and the limitations were so apparent in a way they hadn't been in 1996, whatever it was when it came out. And that just isn't something you can give to a new gamer who's grown up on much more polished, or certainly more flexible mechanics, and say play this because it's a classic. So I think that is an argument for remaking stuff so that new people can experience these wonderful stories.
Yeah, I played Tomb Raider Anniversary, which got, I think, some stick at the time.
Which one was that?
Well, that was the basically remake.
Was that when she is in Canary Wharf?
No, I don't think so. I think it's mostly Egypt. It might be entirely Egypt.
Yeah.
So it's a remake of...
I remember the Crocs.
Of early ones. And
very scary.
I was playing it and thinking, I'm enjoying this, but it's not that different from the original, is it? And sure, it's all a bit shiny, but they could have done more. And then I played that they had, whether there was an extra in the menu or a hidden extra in the game, I can't remember. just the original levels with the original Lara character in, and it was horrifying. It was like looking at one of those AI distortions of photographs, because the game that I was playing looked nothing like the game in my imagination, because of course our old friend Epiphania fills in a lot of the gaps, and any well-made game makes the most use of Epiphania. And then if 20 years ago later some bastard armed with a machine that's 1,000 times faster, with tech that's 1,000 times more sophisticated, comes along and remakes it, obviously it makes the first thing embarrassed by comparison. I have a particular, you're talking about games coming back to childishness
in the nicest possible way.
I know, but I think one of the reasons is because, as you said, games make the world comprehensible and manageable and controllable. So we sort of go back to that same
It's like
place.
settling into a nice chair. You kind of recognise that there are constraints, you recognise it's been designed for you to make you enjoy your time, and you kind of know what you're getting.
And some games explicitly don't. You know, some games then try to make you uncomfortable for art. And
but it's interesting that I don't think those ones tend to be the ones who are subject to nostalgia. You get scary games and horror games, but something that I can't think of one. Though as I'm losing faith in my own statement.
I'm not sure. I think honestly, the idea of games that make you uncomfortable is really something that's only come up in the last 15 years.
What kind of? I believe you, but what kind of example?
Sort of alt games, the sort of things you get experiments on.
Experimental games.
I'm thinking, Liz Ryerson did something called Problematic, which I think was an early-ish, much lauded example of the form. And a lot of these things tend to be sort of interesting if you're judging an award and aren't what I play usually. But also, again, some of the things in Culture Simulator are meant to be difficult or experimental, and in Sunless Sea, it's you knock out one of the walls and say, we know this is janky or difficult, but we're going to do it. But the other thing is just the history, because games started out as one leg was in children's games, another in board games, and chess was not taken seriously.
Yes, you told me this.
Yeah,
because it was a game.
Yeah, people like Lasker, I think, and Capablanca, who were world bestriding grandmasters, couldn't really make a living as chess masters because there wasn't the system there was now. They could play people like for bets. But I
think there is a bit of a moral suspicion around games. I remember when I was looking into the history of card games, when I was making a deck that was drawing from this sort of 19th century card mechanics, there was this real suggestion that any cards were sort of societal weakness or moral weakness. And I think it was certainly with cards, it was because the original, back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, cards were basically gambling. So that was obviously a kind of moral thing that society didn't really want it. But I think also there's a suspicion of leisure time, I think, which probably goes back to moral things as well, that if you're an adult and you have downtime, why are you playing something like a child? Why aren't you doing something productive, or why aren't you doing something like reading the Bible, or why aren't you I think there's a lot of kind of expectation of adults to be very distinct from children, and anything that blurred that line was sort of inherently suspect. And I know that in the modern day, particularly men, because you tend to make up the majority of games, traditional games, setting aside the fact that a lot of women play mobile games, which is a slightly different thing. I've heard again and again and again this sense that men are slightly embarrassed by it, or made to feel embarrassed by it, and their partners kind of say, yeah, it's great, but why don't you come with me and go to a party or something. And I know that you've had personal experience of that too, that you felt that gaming, I don't know, I get the sense that there is still a slight kind of societal sense that gaming is a bit sort of
there is, and I think that's fundamental. And there's a guy called Huizinga who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, and beginning of the 20th century, and he made the point. Well, his thesis was that play is not something we should be suspicious of, because it's fundamental and natural, and a lot of things we regard as grown-up behaviour are actually play. Not only things like religion and ceremony and courtship, but also the law, particularly in the British context, he saw as an example of play, these sort of duelling barristers. And I think he overstated the case.
That sounds a bit sort of...
I think he overstated the case because he was pushing against exactly the kind of suspicion you're talking about. So he made the case hard. But of course, part play is the stuff that doesn't put beans on the table, unless you're making games, of course, in which case it's work.
Unless you're like us.
but even then, I quite enjoy my job, but
it's work though, isn't it?
But it's work, and I want to stop.
Exactly,
sometimes.
It feels different than sitting down to play a game that you've chosen to play because
and that's the thing. Play is the stuff you do when you don't have to do. And this is back to Tom Sawyer and the whitewashing the fence. Is if you pay to whitewash a fence, then you're doing it for fun. If you're being paid to do it, then it's work. That's a real difference. And one of my irritations with,
but that's part. Sorry, finish.
No, I was going to say one of my irritations with the conversation about games. Is the fucking... You could go into any mainstream newspaper at any time in the past, probably 20 years, certainly 10, probably 20, and find an article basically saying, ooh, this game is about something serious and interesting. You might think computer games are just about shooting people, but actually this one is.
Gosh, I'm very bored of that.
And equally, you could go into any games site from the last 20 years in any given year and find an article saying... this game, which is made by a small team of committed individuals, unlike all those silly man shooters, is going to do something really serious and interesting. It's got something to say about mortality or colonialism or gender politics or child rearing or ecology, and it grinds my gears because you don't see people publish these articles in film or books or other media. The assumption is, well, yes, obviously this film, this book, this piece of art, this sculpture, this fucking Baxi graffito is relevant to adults because it's art, and art is relevant to adults. And if game developers and people writing about games spent less time banging on about how we need to treat games as adult things, they should be taken seriously, then we would get there a lot quicker. So end of the lesson.
But I think part of that is that out of all those art forms that you've mentioned, games is the one thing that you're allowed to play as a child but are looked down upon from when you play it as an adult. And so that, I think, is quite profound, because a lot of people who are gamers, which is a term that I have problems with, but a lot of people might identify as a gamer, a lot of it is quite identity. It's about them. They're a nerd and they like it and they want to put game posters up all over their house, and they want to invest in a really pretty rig, and it's really important to them that they play lots of games, and I can see that those individuals might find it frustrating to constantly feel as though they're doing something childish, and therefore want to constantly make the point that actually I'm playing a game and it's
and that was a slightly sort of cranky point. I just think.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I'm just saying, I can see that games has a particularly complicated relationship with this sense of nostalgia and going back to childhood. I was thinking the other day, there was a handheld console that came out, was announced, I should say, I think 2 years ago now, because the pandemic screwed everything up, called Playdate, which was a sort of Game Boy-like thing with sort of crank, like mechanical crank, and everyone lost their minds over it. And I'm sure it's exciting and interesting. Says she, belying her own point. But it hadn't really struck me that its name, Playdate, actually encapsulates a hell of a lot of kind of really child-orientated experiences. I mean, Playdate, I don't know I grew up in America, so I get confused about terminology, but I assume that you also described sending a kid to play with a friend.
Yes, I think it's quite a recent import, but yeah.
But certainly in America, that's what it was called. It was a play date, and of course it implies, playing a game is obvious. And the fact that it looks retro, it isn't a sort of glossy, shiny, new glass, edgeless thing that kind of, the App Store would sell you. It's a deliberately kind of retro, harking back to the earlier days with kind of physicality, again, a sense of kind of, I want to touch things. I don't just want this kind of ephemeral digital world that we now live in. I want something I can actually wind up and then play, and it will remind me of kind of Pokemon 1, whatever it's called, Pokemon Red or Yellow, probably, whoever, doesn't matter.
You're right.
I hadn't really clocked that.
No, and now you mention it, I think about the most popular game in the United Kingdom by an order of magnitude is obviously football.
Oh, right, you mean game.
And that's the thing.
I was like, I don't actually know. What's charting?
And I think you get a variety of opinions on football.
You love football.
So I don't have the whatever gene a lot of men.
He does not.
A lot of men have that allows them to enjoy football. I do not. I get occasionally really slightly grumpy. Well, anyway, but the point is, although some people go over the top with football, and Nick Hornby writes books about people's relationship with football clubs and all the rest of it, is not susceptible to accusations of childishness. You know, you might get the occasional
That's a good point.
grumpy commentator saying, 2 teams of grown men kicking a inflated bladder around a field.
But yeah,
that's not
shut up.
Yeah, exactly. It's just nobody takes it seriously. No, I don't think people might say might feel that their attachment to their what would you even say? Team, club. There's people listening to this go, club. You know, like the Arsenal, Millwall, or whatever.
Like one of my best friends is a super Man City fan, and as you know, Man City have a famous rivalry between Man City and Man United.
Yeah, it took me a long time to understand even what people were talking about when they said that. I keep making these jokes, I was supposed to understand. But the point is, people might feel that their attachment is not treated with sufficient respect, or other people might find it baffling. I know sort of Alistair Campbell, for example, the Labour
he was a big football supporter,
communications guy. His attachment to his club has always been a sort of big part of his life, and I find it hard to get. But nobody would say that's childish or stupid.
Yes.
Because things are serious if they're taken seriously.
Well, and also it's fundamentally social, which is another thing I discovered when I was reading around nostalgia before we did this podcast. Nostalgia has often a very specifically social component. So when people think back about their childhood or things they remember, it's much more likely they will think back to a particular birthday party or a particular interaction between humans rather than that time that I sat alone in the attic reading a book all day, which might be your personal memory, but it tends to have this sort of like human kind of texture to it, that it's about togetherness. And I think football is so clearly a sort of mass experience with all the fans and it's a team sport, right? It's not even like you're supporting a single sports star. It's like everyone kind of is in it together and they feel their identity as part of that. Which I think is possibly something to do with it.
Well, here's an interesting. I think you're right. I think also this is so off my patch. I feel uncomfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
But I understand with the footballs. One of the things I hear people talk about is how they went with usually their father.
Yes.
When they were growing up, so that feels like part of their identity and a link to their past.
Yeah.
And so it is something often that people loved when they were a kid and continue to love when they grew up.
Yeah.
But games, it's unusual for the current generation of adults. That's how I remember playing games with my parent. I think it probably will be more common in I mean, you know, I've played games with Sonia.
I think I'm the first generation of people who have those memories.
I remember you sort of saying, you know, watching your father playing, in fact, Tomb Raider and
Exactly.
So I wonder if that will quietly divert the attitude into a river where we don't think of it as a childish thing because we grew up playing with. Yeah, but when I say it out loud, it sounds really obvious. If you grow up seeing your parents do something, then you think of it as a grown-up thing. If you grow up, my mother was
That's
unbelievably
true.
scornful about the D&D
She's
books
quite a proper
for
lady.
years. Yes. So she, you know what the lowest tier of cultural consumption as far as she was concerned was
D&D.
paperback books.
What? Oh yes, you told me this because you thought books should sort of be hardbound and.
Well, yes. So as far as she was concerned, buying paperback books, especially as I buy a lot of sort of genre books.
If she listens to this, I disavow everything he's saying, Penny.
She doesn't.
Just covering my
doesn't
butt
listen
there.
to these. She watches this on the Twitters though. But to be clear, I adore my mother, and she did a really good job of bringing me up, especially as a single mother with 2 boys. But we never see eye to eye on the old paperback books because I loved books. I wanted to read all the books I could, and I got excited. I wanted to buy books and read them. As far as my mother was concerned, it's a waste of money because if you wanted to read a book, you got it out of the library and you didn't have to pay for it and you get back.
But you do read books again and again.
I do, well, you know, but some I do, some I don't. But also, I think a lot of the paperback books I bought were genre ones and the kind of covers you got on fantasy and science fiction books
Did
in
not
the
inspire
80s.
confidence in the content.
No, I was showing you the Michael Moorcock ones the other day.
Yeah, they were pretty shocking.
Yeah, and so she sort of generally associated it with this sort of, and again, this is what happened with like lending libraries in the days of Austen. Is all these young ladies are reading these sensational novels that gave them wrong ideas about the way the world worked and entrained their emotions in unhelpful ways when they should have been learning how to knit, bear children, and you know, both at the same time. And
the ideal woman.
so yeah, we solved it. I don't think it's really solved sequels though. I don't know if you solved sequels.
Well, I was just going to say, so I tied it all up in a neat bow.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share something quite personal with our listeners, and they maybe think it's TMI, but I don't want kids. It's just not something that I've ever felt I was interested in. And something that my mother said to me, I found very compelling, which is, she said, obviously this is your choice and it's up to you and whatever. I think they would probably quite like me to have kids because they like kids, but sorry. But she said that the one thing I would say is that as a woman, when you have a kid, you suddenly become a part of the warp and weft of human society in a way that you just cannot engage with if you haven't actually gone through something that millions and millions and millions of women have done before you. The fact that you can grow this kid and give birth to this kid and then have this tiny thing that you rear up into this human is a sort of astonishingly profound experience that just connects everybody who has done it. And if you don't do that, you will always just miss out on that experience, but you'll also gain, of course, because you'll have other opportunities, yada yada. So that, I find that very moving, and I'm obviously getting slightly emotional about it now. But what you said about this transmission from the parent to the child of the experience, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things I was looking at when I was reading around sequels and things that we could talk about was Toy Story. Because a lot of people say that sequels are rarely as good as the original because, they don't capture the magic, or they kind of cargo culted and they kind of just remade it without recognising what was really brilliant about the first one and doing something a bit different. And I think Pixar and Toy Story are a great example of sequels done right, particularly Toy Story 3. And Toy Story 3 has this explicit theme of moving on. And there's lots and lots of things in it that cohere to that theme, in the same way that lots and lots of writing in Sunless was about home, even though it didn't say, this is a story about being away from home, whatever. And at the very end, there's this very moving scene, the finale, and I'm afraid I'm going to spoil a movie from 2010, people, where the central kid, who was a proper kid in the original and is by now, I think, heading off to college, so he's about, 18, I assume, hands over his beloved toys, Woody particularly, to this little girl because he doesn't need them anymore, and he hesitates, particularly with Woody, because that's the sort of central character. I'm getting emotional about it, and he gives it over to this little girl who clearly is in the right stage of her life to really enjoy it, and after the hesitation, he sort of accepts that this is the stage he's in now, and he's excited to move on. And I think everybody in that audience really resonates with that, because it's about giving what you had to your kids. It's about recognizing that time doesn't stand still and things change, and that's okay and that's good, but also how precious the kind of past is, and how important it is to people, and how lovely that you can turn that, rather than a loss, into a sort of transmission from one generation to the next. So I'm calming down now, everyone, don't worry. But I think that's a really beautiful thing, and I think maybe games hasn't quite had that yet. And the moment, as you say, that we do start transmitting our experiences of the genres that we play and experience and love to our kids, rather than sort of trying to gatekeep it and say, no, this is mine and I want to experience it again, I want to be 8, and instead saying, I want my 8-year-old to feel how I did. I think that might be the moment that we turn into something really beautiful.
I think there's we've been drawing a distinction lately between things that one likes, things that one enjoys, and things that one is glad that one's done. And obviously, what one enjoys eating cake, one is glad that one has not eaten cake as a stoic thing. But more than that, there's games that you can play for hours and then feel at the end of it a bit empty and annoyed. And there's other games that you can play and really come away feeling they've added something to your existence. Yeah. Same with other art forms, all the rest of it. And thinking, oh my God, my fucking memory, coming up to 50 people, this is how it gets. Okay. God damn it, Blood Meridian.
The Road, Cormac McCarthy.
Cormac McCarthy, thank you. So Cormac McCarthy, obviously...
Don't make me revisit Blood Meridian.
I won't. God, no. But brilliant though it is, but awful it is.
At some point I'm going to have to read it, and I'm going to be
Cormac
so
McCarthy
sad.
Is... so obviously he wrote the book that No Country for Old Men, Back to the Cohens again, was based on. And there is a dream that the Tommy Lee Jones character recounts. Now I'm emotional. Fuck.
We can't do a podcast nostalgia
at the end, and he talks about it in the book as well,
emotion.
where he says, he talks about a dream he had about his father who's dead, and how his father gave him a horn. You do it, you know this.
I don't know it, I'm afraid.
God damn it.
I can't carry you.
Gave him a horn to carry that had in it a fire like the moon in it. And it was his job to carry it on, sort of into the darkness. And when you think the world isn't an ideal place, it's still your job to keep carrying on that fire and giving it to the next generation. and as you could tell, it spoke to me.
Did that touch you?
A little bit. And I still can't describe it without blabbing, but like a lot of really good art, I would find it hard to explain in 200 words clearly why it touched me and what it says about it that works. But yeah, there is something about passing things on that I guess. Well, here's.
I think that's the thing.
Here's we go. The two things all humans have in common. Every human who's ever lived. Every human who's ever lived has been gestated in a mother, and every human who's ever lived has then ceased to live. So we're born and we die. Those are the two things the bookend has. So the job of an adult is to die and to make and to make things better for your kids.
Okay, I was going to put it in slightly less horrible terms.
Have you read my work?
Oh God, I was going to say. I mean, I think you're right, of course, but I think that's not really what people are recognising. I think that the idea of giving something away is it's the recognition that it's not for you anymore, and I think that's really magical. The sense that it's not, like I said, it's not a sort of bad thing. It's not being taken away from you, but you can now pass on the fire to someone else. It takes a lot of maturity to recognise that. I certainly was not a particularly good sharer when I was a little girl, and I think knowing that it's okay to move on is a really adult thing to be able to recognise, and then look towards as an exciting thing. No one really looks forward to death, but certainly there are wonderful things that happen in your late adult life that just are not available to you when you're 8 or whatever. And recognising that for what it is and saying this is a new experience for me on kind of my journey, I think is really lovely, while allowing it and certainly facilitating it in your case with your little girl. It's the generation after us. It's really beautiful.
The sequels.
That's sequels done properly, not like miserable sequels like Skeleton Songs with a 2 in it. Well, I think what we discovered there, listeners, is that Alexis and I have some hormonal imbalance, which means that we cry a lot.
It's my time of month.
And that nostalgia is a really powerful emotion, or that he's a werewolf, that's true. But yes, please share with us if you have any examples of your own game-related nostalgia. And I apologise for weeping. We definitely didn't. That was the cats.
No, British people don't cry.
No, well, you used blubbing, which did make me happy. And yeah, have a spooky and not weepy day.
Full moon.